You're tuned in to RX Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this week's episode of RX Radio, here with the one and the only Eric Bugera. Thanks for being here today, Eric. Today, our talk was about hypertrophy training and basically all the facets of all the applications that this really should be a portion of everyone's training, no matter what you're training for. So we kind of dove in on what that entails, how to structure it, different populations, and how they're going to best receive this type of training. So I thought it was a really informative conversation. I learned a lot from it, as you always can from Eric. Just a couple of things that we have coming up. Today, the 22nd, we have the Prescript Level 1 starting today, so you can still register. You'll get a recording of the first week if you missed the lecture live, but that's a 16 to 20 week course. All things about anatomy, applied biomechanics. So check that out if you guys haven't yet. Check out the Prescript Level 1. Eric has the hypertrophy course launching in April of this year. I don't know why I said that. Obviously, it's this year, or else we wouldn't be talking about it right now. But coming up soon, so keep an eye out for that. Everything you need to know about hypertrophy, which will be more than we talk about in this podcast in more depth. Aside from that, you can catch Eric in the collective. He's the collective guy. Literature reviews. Catch him in the technique labs and in the Discord channel. And aside from that, we have a webinar coming up. So what's your webinar about?
It's going to be one of the major facets that people are trying to apply to their hypertrophy training now that I feel like I can help fill in some of the gaps in how it works and how to apply it. So the length tension relationship, and then strength curves and resistance profiles and how they would apply to your training, and how to at least better understand where and when to apply them.
Awesome. Yeah, that's pretty hot topic, pretty buzzwordy around the internet right now. So I know you're going to approach it with a very factual approach and kind of debug a lot of things for that. So I'll be in that one. You guys look out for that. You can sign up through the Prescript website, www.pre-script.com. Catch Eric there, and then catch him in the hypertrophy course coming up. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the episode. We're back. Eric Bugera, the people's champ. I don't know. We need a cool nickname for you for the podcast. Cat Dad?
There's Cat Dad. There's Hypertrophy Czar now, apparently. Killian has me as the director of research. There's a lot of names that are just made up, honestly.
I think all of these names are made up, but they're all fitting. So the Hypertrophy Czar here. Eric Bugera.
Go with that.
Yeah. How are things?
Things are good. I get to hang out in the afternoon with my BFF and just talk about training. So nothing really to complain about there.
Yeah, can't beat it. This is second, third appearance on the podcast, depending on which order these come out in. So I think a lot of the people in the Prescript Collective are probably very familiar with you. You're the guy. You're the research guy, director of research. So thanks for being here. Thanks for spending your afternoon with me. I think after our last seminar, which would have been Edmonton, where you got stuck in Edmonton for, I don't know, a couple extra days, more days than you wanted to spend in Edmonton. I've told everyone this story, by the way, and now everyone that listens to the podcast is going to hear it. I think you did the most out of character thing I've ever seen you do. Is we had a text message exchange, and in that exchange, you ended it with the heart hands emoji, and it just warmed my heart. It really did.
If I can map my true personality through emojis, or even better than that, if I can condense as much of my communication skills down to emojis and just expedite my entire life, it's all voice notes and emojis now. I don't want to type anything. It's way too much effort to hit the right buttons.
Yeah, it's basically hieroglyphics is what it is. Modern hieroglyphics. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you being here. Oh, the lag gets you. But I appreciate you being here. It's always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. The the topic of discussion lately has been hypertrophy, especially with you. If again, it depends when you guys are hearing these, what order they come out. But hopefully, you guys know that Eric is he has made the prescript hypertrophy course. He will be teaching that upcoming in the near future. But I don't want to talk too much about the course. I just want to talk about training today with you. I think a lot of people, they get their start into training through hypertrophy, whether that's with a trainer, whether that's them just getting a gym membership. I know when I started training, it was with a friend's dad. It was in just like kind of a private commercial type gym. And basically our split was Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We would go through, we would bench press, and then we would do every upper body machine. And then what would we do? We would squat, and then we do every lower body machine, and then we would deadlift, and we would do forearm rolly things, and then leave. And that was it.
Shout out for
Uh,
every good gym when
yeah.
you were like 16, 17 had one of those things. I still miss mine, and mine was like in an asbestos filled underground university gym. That was probably my first real experience. And it was effectively what you just described. Monday, Wednesday, Friday,
Yes.
we're doing chest and biceps, not even upper body,
Always.
just chest and biceps. It took me several months to discover that the back existed, even longer to discover that legs existed. And he just built it from there. I think it's an accurate representation. Like nobody wants to admit that they didn't know shit about shit when they first got started, but you just did what felt good, and then slowly discovered more things in the gym that actually, just because I can't see it outright, I should probably start adding these things in.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's, I think, a lot of the people that we talk to on a daily, weekly basis through whether it's Prescript or the collective, I think they probably have a similar origin story and how they got into training. And then you just kind of get the bug, you get hooked, and you start learning. And I think you have probably went down that rabbit hole more than anyone, or at least as much as anyone on the internet or on the planet, especially when it comes to hypertrophy. And I think that's a really cool background to have because it's you've lived it. We've lived it, right? It's you've been there. You've been that guy that just kind of did the thing. You walked in, you pulled on the handles on the machine or pushed on the handles, and then you did curls because curls. All the way up to the point where now there's a thought process behind it. It's very well thought out, regimented. There's a reason behind every single piece of the program, and I think that's something that it doesn't just happen, right? It takes time, it takes effort. You have to refine that process time after or over your career, over your training career, and I think that's something that's becoming more and more accessible to some extent, right? It happens to various degrees. There's people that are better at this, and there's people that are worse at this. Um, but I think the thing about you and the clientele that you train is that would you say that most of your clients are on a hypertrophy type program?
Yeah, I'd say the vast majority are on a hypertrophy based foundation that gives them the ability to offshoot if they ever want to specialize any further than that. And it kind of comes from the standpoint that it can provide like movement competency, general strength, general work capacity, general everything because of the nature of how you can actually train for hypertrophy. Set and rep schemes are very fluid. Loading schemes by proxy of that can be very fluid. So like if it's someone that has aspirations of one day doing powerlifting, even in the back of their mind, a solid hypertrophy block can be something. And when I say block, I don't mean 8 to 12 weeks. I mean just do it ad nauseum until you decide you have a different goal. That's primarily how hypertrophy works. Just do it forever, and then once you get bored of it, maybe add something else, maybe. But yeah, it serves for like day one clients. It serves as a great vehicle for me to be able to like teach them how to move and then show them in like a very incremental process, how this exercise that we're using because you have a training age of infant, the things that you learned here, we just discussed this a little bit off camera, but I need you to be able to implement that into the next tier of exercise. Maybe it's a little bit less stable, maybe it's a little bit less machine like and more free weight like, but it adds to their ability to then, should they want to offshoot into a more athletic venture, Olympic lifting, sports specific, powerlifting, anything. Now they have a foundation of at least a little bit of exposure to movement competency because hypertrophy, again, it has the luxury of being able to be pursued in its incremental pace. Like really any progress for any goal is very incremental. It's not like you just, I found the correct training parameters for hypertrophy. I'm going to get there like exponentially faster than everybody else. Like, no, you're going to get there faster, maybe, but not exponentially. And so taking the time to do that kind of incremental process, again, it teaches skills that are probably cross applicable more than just sprinting towards that finish line.
Yeah, I agree so much. And fuck optimal. But um, as we think of hypertrophy training, as we hear the word hypertrophy training, I think a lot of people, just because it's a big word and it's associated with training, assume that it's this advanced training technique, right? Like hypertrophy training, bodybuilding, right? When that's not necessarily the case. When I'm sure you work with people that have bodybuilding or body composition type goals, but I think, I don't know. I kind of get this tunnel vision is that I'm in, you probably get this too, is that we're in this world of training, right? Whatever it is. And that's when I go on my phone, if I scroll the internet, that's all I fucking see. So we are so in it. But a lot of people are not as exposed to this, or not as submersed in this industry. They're the people that are seeking out people like you to help them train, right? And I think, was it movement competency? I think is the wording that you use. I like that wording a lot because that's exactly what hypertrophy training is, right? We have, and the way that these movements kind of go on a spectrum is we have more isolation based movements or we have more integration based movements, right? And the more isolated it is, that's typically going to be more machine based, more external support, things that we really only have to focus on moving at one joint or using one muscle group at a time, right? As opposed to the whole, as we go through the spectrum, there's going to be more integrated muscles, which, we could use like the comparison of maybe a quad extension is going to be more isolated versus a squat is going to be more integrated, where we have to understand how to control the core, move at the hip, move at the knee, move at the ankle, our weight distribution through our foot. We have to understand the balance of all these things, or the pendulum of hip to knee to how we're moving and controlling our center of mass. So it starts out, pretty simple. It's just, move your knee, bend and extend your knee, to a whole bunch of shit that we have to learn how to coordinate and organize in a very specific way, all in the dimension of time. So I think the thing that people maybe, well, I don't know, maybe I'm speaking from my perspective, maybe people don't think this broadly, but when we think hypertrophy training, it's not this super advanced, like tons of drugs bodybuilding. It's just movement competency is what it is. There's so many benefits that you can get from just learning to use your body in terms of like proprioception. Neuromuscular awareness is, where is your body in space? Do you know how to use the muscles that bend your elbow or bend and extend your knee? And then as a byproduct of hypertrophy is you're going to increase your base level of strength also, which, kind of ripples into you being better at literally everything in life. So I think there's a lot of really cool benefits that you get from hypertrophy training. And this is a little bit off topic, but a lot of the population that I work with, we don't have many machines in my gym. So it's a lot of people that haven't really been exposed to this type of training, but they want to try weightlifting. They want to get on a barbell. And they're starting at such a deficit because they haven't had exposure to this type of training. They haven't had this awareness brought to specific muscle groups, or they haven't built that proprioception, or they haven't learned how to use things in isolation and then gone down that spectrum to learn how to use them in an integrated way. So I think when we talk hypertrophy training, it's not this super advanced like bodybuilders that are like, I don't know, 100 or 275 pounds. It's just learning how to use your body. And then, like you said, you just do that ad nauseum. That's how you get big, is you learn how to do that and you learn how to do it well, and you just continually do it forever, and you eat a bunch of food. And that's how you turn it into these, into that thing that's, the sport of bodybuilding. But I think that for trainers in general, the most important thing that they can do is learn how to do this well, or learn how to teach people how to do this well. And that's going to be the base of your clientele. Like even a lot of the people that I work with from rehab and weightlifting perspectives, a lot of the basis of that comes from hypertrophy type principles, is that they need to understand specific things in isolation before we can have them all work together as a system. So that's kind of how I view hypertrophy training and where it fits into, I don't know, the general kind of overview or general scope of just training in general.
Yeah, you said a couple of things I really resonate with, like especially it's the thing that gives breadcrumbs that connects the dots on so many different aspects of training. Like from your perspective as someone that does Olympic lifting, you've done CrossFit, you've done these more advanced movement patterns. You don't just hand someone a barbell and have them on their first day perform at the highest level the most advanced technique. There's probably going to be components of that you break down, you teach them in parts. And that's what I think people skip over for hypertrophy because it can go like really full circle. Day one, someone doesn't really know how to do almost anything in the gym. It's force production and just a shotgun blast. Throw shit at the wall and force production. Get them on a machine, make sure that it's effort as opposed to necessarily a ton of skill. Pepper in the more skill based things that you can start giving them that early breadcrumb of association with so you can start to build off of that. Slowly but surely, maybe you use sensation based cueing, maybe you use constraints so they can only hit certain positions that then provide the right sensation, but you're trying to mold them like clay so that someone that has minimal experience can then go from, say, only force production with a leg press or a hack squat per se into only force production as the only thing going through their mind on, say, a squat. That's a long journey. And there's a ton of implements, there's a ton of set and repetition schemes, there's a ton of variables at play there that you can be harnessing to, again, use it as like the foundation to give them a skill set that's applicable across the board to everything. Or they just live in that realm forever, like I kind of do, where I've, again, even for me, I've tap danced on a couple different things, always to sort of revisit the mean of hypertrophy because A, I'm not an athlete, and B, I do the thing that I really enjoy the most, which is just trying hard, feeling good, and improving my body composition, improving my physique. But it all is a lot easier to tailor when we're able to break people from that mindset that you spoke of hypertrophy equals bodybuilding. It's like the every square is a rectangle or every rectangle is a square, but not the opposite way, whichever way that's supposed to work because shapes. Bodybuilding is absolutely hypertrophy training, but not every variation of hypertrophy training needs to be strictly bodybuilding. It's not necessarily a physique or a judgment criteria based art form or sport, however you look at it. It's what does this person want? What does this person need potentially for a future goal? Even the raising of the idea of rehab. I don't need to tell you, but for anybody listening that hasn't really experienced a lot of rehab in their life, it might start lower, but it kind of often lives in a hypertrophy training parameter, like a 8 to 10 to 12 to 15 reps with loads that are commensurate with being challenging-ish in that rep range because you need something that's actually going to stimulate muscle tissue as opposed to structural loading, and probably going in that rep ranges with that loading scheme would be the thing that does it. It's not going to challenge joint integrity. It's going to allow them to actually do the skill correctly to execute and get the return on investment they want. It all comes back to like having, I guess another way of looking at that, again, using the rehab sort of analogy here, is that it allows you to be tissue orientated as opposed to just structure and tissue and get the job done sort of tunnel vision. So there's a ton of different aspects to it that apply everywhere, but more than anything else, using it as a teaching tool is one of the most probably underutilized things that I've seen since I've gotten more into we'll call it the quote unquote education space, because I think Shallow wants to ban that as from our lexicon. Being an educator is a bad word or something like that. But ever since entering that space, it's something that I think people are, this is super tangent now, but people are afraid of being wrong in the eyes of the internet when they're being right in the eyes of the context that matters. Like
Right.
shooting for the optimal, you raised the word first, not me, but shooting for the optimal is completely the wrong direction to go in if that person does not benefit from doing that. But if I say those words out loud in the wrong context, the pitchforks and the flaming torches are coming because I said something wrong about hypertrophy in a vacuum on the internet. So it's something that I think is missed a lot of times, like using the incremental learning process and using it to see if we can't teach someone, again, to circle all the way back, movement competencies that'll have a longer term return on investment.
Yeah. I I love that perspective, by the way. There's a couple things in there that you said that really resonated with me. Um, the the second of which that you said, it's not the first you said, but hypertrophy doesn't equal bodybuilding. And I really like that statement a lot, because hypertrophy should exist in a phase of any effective program, period. Right? Whether it's strength, whether it's bodybuilding. This is the first thing you said, is you're going to live in that realm for something like bodybuilding, but strength training, sport performance, whatever the training is, there should be a hypertrophy phase, and that kind of equals a rehab type phase, right? Is that you also touched on that, is that rehab kind of lives in that hypertrophy style of training, which is very true, because a lot of times when people have issues that rehab is going to be the answer for, it's because imbalances exist, whether they're imbalances in muscle mass, whether they're repetitive movement patterns that person starts to bias. It happens because they start to favor a specific way of moving that is maybe going to lean more on the structure, or it's going to overload tissues on one side versus the other. So hypertrophy is really effective in circumventing that, because we start to build proprioceptive awareness. We learn how to, you know, in to say words, we learn how to run current through a system that we typically don't run current through, right? Is that if I'm always biased towards picking up dumbbells with my right hand and I never do it with my left hand, then I need to start to learn to pick things up with my left hand. And hypertrophy type training it does that, like I said, in that spectrum of isolation to integration. It's going to start from an isolated manner, is that we're going to learn how to maybe use the muscles that grip. We're going to use the muscles that bend and extend the elbow. We're going to use the muscles around the shoulder in a more isolated way. And then we can start to integrate those things into something that looks like me grabbing dumbbells with my left hand, whatever. But hypertrophy is going to be the thing that allows us to do that, because of those things that I mentioned earlier, is that we're building awareness of how to use those muscle groups that typically, when we have a bias, the reason we have that bias is because we feel more coordinated, or we're more aware of how to run current through the right side of the system versus the left side of the system, or the anterior hip versus the posterior hip. So we can use those hypertrophy principles to now start to, in a more controlled way, run current through the less biased side of that equation, so that we can learn in a very safe scenario, piece by piece, and then start to put those pieces together where we can now move in a more symmetrical way. So I think that's a really important thing to point out, is that hypertrophy training, we're going to get those benefits. We're going to, yes, hopefully increase muscle mass. We're going to get strength benefits. We're going to get benefits through awareness of how to activate specific muscle groups and what that sensation feels like. So that's something that in any program, no matter what you're doing, if it's something that's thought out and periodized and there's an end goal, that should exist in there somewhere. It doesn't have to be the entire program, which is something I want to ask you about, but it does need to exist to some extent, and you'll have to come back and touch that every now and then, is because once you go through, the peaks and valleys of, we'll say strength training, because that's what I'm most familiar with, or sport performance training, is that you're going to get to these points where your training is so sport specific that you're going to lose some of the qualities that you benefited from when you had a hypertrophy phase, or when you had that awareness, and you're going to develop imbalances. You're going to be the shape of your sport. So coming off of that and going back to a phase where you're focused on more isolated movement, and building awareness of, oh, this is how it feels on the right versus this is how it feels on the left. There's a ton of value in that, and it'll never go away. That's something you'll always have to come back to, as long as you want to have an upward trajectory in sport or performance in general. The thing I want to ask you about, though, is that you mentioned the words living in the realm of hypertrophy training. And that's something that is, I've kind of been there in the past, but at this point I'm so far removed from it. It's very foreign to me. So can you kind of tell me what that process looks like, and how you can implement that with a client while keeping them engaged, keeping them interested, and keeping them progressing?
Yeah, I think a big thing that leads my thought process here, especially with the average human, the clientele base that I used to train in commercial gyms, even to now, taking on a lot of the times it is trainers, that we're all humans first. We're all, just because someone is a trainer doesn't mean they don't have exposure to movement compensations, previous injuries, the whole thing that you deal with anybody really. But the idea of scaling everything to the lowest hanging, the weakest link in the chain that might be preventing progress, like being very honest and scaling things to that first, and then being completely diligent with incremental progress, incremental progressions before ever thinking periodization, which in its truest form, periodization within hypertrophy, maybe deep into someone's almost professional level of training. But going from first day progressions period, just incremental progressions scaled to the weakest link of whatever their chain may be. If it's grip, if it's a muscular imbalance, if it's an injury you're rehabbing, if it's movement competency, scaling all those things to where that would break first, as opposed to necessarily the actual scaled RPE to just failure of specific muscle tissue. I think that elongates their runway of progression and long-term success immensely. And then also being honest with how long that should take versus how long they should be actually training well, also accounting for all the other moving parts of a actual strong adaptation to training, be it dialing in their nutrition, being good with their sleep, stress management, any of the other factors involved. And knowing that if I have someone on day one and they just have this, it's a basic push-pull legs, maybe they repeat it twice a week, maybe they get through 1.5 per week, who cares? They train 4 to 6 days per week. It's easy stuff. 3 to 6, who cares? Whatever, right? Their first push might be a landmine, half kneeling landmine press that suboptimally targets all of your pressing muscles. Super suboptimal. I hear everybody. I get it. I understand. However, if they have trouble with ribcage over pelvis orientation, if they have trouble understanding how to brace their core, if they have trouble with any sort of scapular stability, especially in a more protracted position that eventually feeds into more of an overhead position, any of these factors that may be that low-hanging weakest link in the chain, I can then scale, subjectively make this a difficult task that should, if we get them close enough to actual failure of the exercise itself, definitely be stimulating rudimentary adaptation for hypertrophy. But on the tail end, let's call it that half kneeling landmine press that is super suboptimal for all of your pressing muscles. If I have you do maybe a, call it like a 2-second eccentric, so you're actually making sure you're keeping load on tissue, maybe a 1-second pause, normal concentric, just press the thing. Concentric, I usually don't mess around with tempo too much on, but in that fully extended and protracted position, we give you a 2-second hold there too, because we're challenging your ability to actually stabilize in a protracted position. Slowly over time, we scale the repetitions probably high down to low, maybe 15 to 12 to 10 to 8. Maybe we have it at an RPE 8 by the end of your sets, and then it becomes 9. Maybe we flirt with a 10, probably not, but we get pretty high. But all of those slow incremental changes week over week, you're getting some form of progressive overstimulus, and you're definitely taxing tissue. It may not be the most magnifying glass isolative way of hitting all of them all at once, but we're also checking the box and building a client. We're future-proofing them such that when they get past these maybe 3 to 6 months of suboptimal hypertrophy in a vacuum training, they now have the highest possible ceiling of progress across almost every single implement they could ever, I don't want to say even want to use, but maybe need to use, because of the example you gave earlier about the training environment you're in, which is barbell heavy, and you can still definitely develop tons of muscle tissue in a barbell heavy environment, but you need to have done all the prerequisites to get yourself to the position where you can actually target muscle tissue in a more specific way with high degrees of effort without having one of those loose links in the chain just explode and then you can't actually perform well. So it's a very slow process in the first maybe 3 to 6 months that gets them to that position where they can just zero in on literally anything they would want. And that can apply to push, to pull, to legs, to all of the things that you and I have experienced. You either handle it and you have that talk with someone early, you handle it, or you just are sprinting headlong towards the plateau that is probably even more frustrating than the slow early progress that is still progress. Because you hit that wall and then all of a sudden it's, well, I was doing RPE 9 on like a chest press and maybe I was doing some super wobbly flies on an incline and I was seeing serious gains and I blew my shoulder out and now I'm doing some bottoms up and that's going to be my entire exercise, whatever, right? You have to cycle them back to things that are genuinely required but also genuinely boring and probably way further away from a stimulating experience, both psychologically as well as physiologically, than they ever would have been in that slower startup process.
Yeah. I like that idea a lot, and future proofing them is a good concept because, especially anyone that's listening to this that has clients, future proofing your clients means that you're continuing to make income off your clients, right? If your clients are hurt and they're not training, then they're not paying you to train them. So I think that's a really important part. And then, like, even in just like a more, not that that's not genuine, but in a way that's more focused around their progress, if you're creating a higher ceiling for them, then they're going to have prolonged progress, or they're going to have either expedited progress or progress over a longer period of time. And I think that's always the part that people start to like. The word plateaus in training, it doesn't make sense to me. There's no such thing as a plateau in training. There's just a lack of organization or a lack of effort. That's all it really comes down to. Lack of organization meaning organization around training, organization around recovery, organization around stress management, whatever that might be. Or with that, they're just not putting in the effort, right? Is if you're doing this right, I think a lot of people confuse effort with proper programming or actually working out properly, right? It doesn't always have to be an objectively heavy or an objectively hard workout for you to continue progress. And actually, it shouldn't always be that way. Maybe in the realm of subjectivity, it should probably be most of the time subjectively difficult. But the way that we can create subjectively difficult workouts is exactly what you said, is by putting them on something that they suck at and they're going to use less weight at, but it's going to be really hard to coordinate that movement. And they're going to have to they're going to be working up a sweat. How many times have you had a client, you give them a bottoms up press and they're like sweating bullets just because they don't really understand how to create a stable enough scapula to actually press from? So it's things like this that create subjective difficulty that are going to, subjective difficulty without objective, difficulty. I don't know how to say that better. Objective challenge, maybe. I don't know. Without heavy loads, we're going to use lighter weights to create subjective challenge because they're having to create better stability or better positions internally. Then that's going to be the thing that allows them to have long-term progress. Because once we go down that road of objectivity, it ends in load, right? And we can progress the load to a point, but after that point, we can't. And something's going to give. And it's going to be, I don't know, your spine or your knee or your shoulder or whatever that might be. So I really like that idea of future proofing your clients. And this is interesting to me, the way that you spoke of that, because it's the same way I speak of strength training, is that what you said was the first thing you would start them with is a half kneeling landmine press. Fantastic exercise. I think there's a lot of benefits to that. But in terms of hypertrophy, that's a less specific movement, right? That's a non-specific hypertrophy movement. So we're starting from non-specific, and maybe what we're doing is we're working towards, at the end, there's fucking sending it at a cable lateral raise, right? Something more specific to shoulder hypertrophy. So that's smart programming, is that we're starting with things that are less specific but are going to increase the capacity or buffer the qualities that you're going to need to be more effective at the more specific things as we get closer to those in the end. And that's the thought process that, if you can approach this, because let me think. I'm trying to say this without offending too many people. It's hypertrophy training can be simple. It should be simple, I think. I think training in general should be simple. But that doesn't mean that it should be this thoughtless process, right? Like, you say it better than me, but effort in drugs. What do you say is effort in volume? I say effort in drugs. You say effort in volume. Will get you big, right? uh,
Yeah.
so that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Is maybe you should talk so I don't get myself in trouble, but that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Is that there are a lot of really big people at every single gym that I go to that do really dumb shit. And you can get big doing dumb shit and drugs, but you can also get healthy and have prolonged progress and maybe not use drugs and still get big. And I think that's the part that kind of gets lost, is that it should be simple, but it should be well thought out. And that's kind of the process that you just drew out there.
maybe this is the first time I've articulated it like this. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe someone will reach out and like tell me I'm an idiot. But I
You're
feel like
probably not
drugs
wrong. You're not
are
an idiot.
like with regards to like muscular development and the needs, like the underlying needs that will help you long term. I feel like drugs act to definitely enhance muscular development, but not necessarily enhance training age. Because the average person can train like a dumbass when they have a young enough training age because everything works because their body is ready to adapt to literally all of it. But as you get more and more advanced, you have to have a more it's bullets in the chamber. You can use anything you really want early, but you need every bullet in the chamber such that when you start to see these walls of, and you said it earlier, plateaus are about organization and effort. These plateaus arise due to that lack of organization and only effort, like effort trying to supersede organization. You sprint towards a potential plateau or a brick wall. Now, what do? So, early in your training, you can get away with doing a ton of things just by effort and volume and just consistency. But at a certain point in time, unless you want to somehow supercharge your effort more and more and just slam your face against a wall, having load or having just the low hanging exercises, the easy hypertrophy exercises, be that blunt force trauma for your progress early. It's not future proofing yourself at all. It's not long term planning, and it doesn't account for like the human factor or the real life factor. Where I'm going to go on a limb and say no one, including competitors, has the perfect layup environment, the perfect layup sort of lifestyle, no drama, no chaos, no nothing that allows them to go from point A to their goal unimpeded by any sort of loss of being on the perfect track, like lack of sleep. You got broken up with, your fucking dog died, you lost your job, you can't get to the gym because it's a snow day, whatever the problem might be, you're whatever, right? An injury, there's something that might happen to literally everybody. So that perfect sort of layup environment does not exist. And again, without having thought well in advance about how can you navigate these issues, with hypertrophy genuinely being probably one of the most pliable ways that you can train, assuming you've put in that legwork, checked the boxes early, and created a more complete client or a more complete trainee as yourself, you're going to run into these walls the same as everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very accurate statement. And no one has that perfect environment, so being able to be pliable in the training becomes that much more important. Um, Kind of off the backs of that, you said something earlier that struck my interest because this has been what I've done the entire time I've trained any type of hypertrophy type stuff. But you mentioned a push-pull leg split. I feel like that's a very widely accepted, widely used training method. Um, when does that not become effective, or does that always become effective?
Depends. Are you a bodybuilder with specific training criteria and physical criteria that your previous contest told you need more of X, more of Y, more days here? How do you personally enjoy training? I'm still thinking about the competitors as well in that statement. How do you personally enjoy training? Because I've spoken with Mac enough times to know, he's got certain layouts for certain, maybe it's a 4 day split. I don't think he really goes over four with most people, but maybe they train their legs compartmentalized several times per week as opposed to push pull leg style where you would generally hit all aspects of your legs within those leg sessions. Maybe you
Right.
don't give a shit and you go bro split. Again, we go experientially versus what the literature says. Generally speaking, if you get the high quality level of training in over the course of the week, dare I say the training volume in, because people hate volume or they love volume, but as long as it's equal across whatever split you're going to do, generally speaking, the progress is also equal. Again, assuming you're doing all the nutritional things, all the recovery things on the back end. So it comes down to genuinely what is the easiest or most consistent or favorable way for you to just organize your goal. So push pull legs, especially if you were able to train maybe 6 days a week or maybe extend your microcycle to be like 8 days instead of 7 or 10, whatever you're going to do. Basically do a double rotation of push pull legs. That affords you a lot of real estate to be able to carve out almost every muscle group that you care about in some semblance of intensity, be it through directly targeting it or through synergistic action, aka barbells or what have you. It's just a very easy and pliable, to use that phrase again, way of organizing training for a lot of people. Is it the GOAT? Yeah, I'd say it is. For most people, most of the time, I'm going as the GOAT.
It's the GOAT. All right.
The Again, if you're not in the confines of you need actual very, very hyper specific criteria that you need to logistically more than anything else organize around,
Yeah.
that's a 3 to 6 day a week training split you can do. Push pull legs, maybe do push pull legs once and then you just update it. Maybe do push pull legs, push pull, and then you update it because that is what fell within the confines of your program. If you're doing what I'm speaking to earlier about sending updates or doing micro progressions or things of that nature to build a client, same though, like upper lower. It's all, as long as it's all there and the effort is there, it's pretty equivalent.
There you go. You heard it from the man himself, Cat Daddy, Eric Bugera. Push pull legs is the GOAT. And the thing is, I think people complicate training unnecessarily, especially people on the internet. Way, way too complicated. But I think that, like you said, within the confines of that, you can carve that out to be what you need it to be, even if you do have relatively specific goals. I think when I asked that question, I was speaking more towards the bulk of who you're going to train. So, as a trainer with clients, I think the majority of your clients, you'll probably see what? If you're in person, it's going to be 1 to 3 times a week is probably the bulk, maybe 1 to 2 even being more realistic. And then if you're online, you're writing, maybe a 3 to 5 to 6 day program for your clients, right? And I think the majority of trainers would say that that's kind of the bulk of where these people are going to fall. And a lot of those people are going to be either beginner to intermediate. I think that's safe to say for people that are working with a trainer. And then there's going to be those people that have carved out a niche like Mac that works with more advanced or people with more specific goals. But I think just knowing that in what you said, because what you say is facts, is that that gives you a very easy way to approach programming for any of your clients, right? If you're going to organize, 3 sessions a week for a beginner to intermediate client, maybe taking that framework that you set before is that we want to start with something that's a little bit more integrated, right? We want to give them something that's going to future proof them. And we want to put that earlier on in their session because we want them to be fresh for it. We don't want any fatigue going to be influencing the way that they're moving or the way that they're coordinating this more integrated, more complex movement pattern. And we want to use that to buffer their capacity down the road, maybe weeks, months, years down the road, so that they can continue to train. And then after that, we're going to break it off into things that are maybe a little bit more isolated. Maybe we're working in a load ability spectrum, is that maybe we start off skill heavy and then we work, and correct me if I'm wrong with this is my interpretation, but it would be maybe more load bias after that. And then we work more isolation bias towards the end, more external support, more output based. Does that sound like that could be a relatively generic framework that would work for most people in terms of hypertrophy training?
Yeah, it goes down to, like, if we're being more realistic about what most people in person might find, the 1 to 3 days per week. I think that there's the leap that people make for bang for your buck, which is the more integrated work that you're talking about, not realizing that you need a client that's capable of what the unifying sort of mechanism of growth will be. And it's across like strength as well, is how close to failure can you cleanly and safely get? And so they'll jump
Yeah.
towards more of the integrated exercises like like a barbell press, maybe dumbbell press. They'll do the hinge, they'll do the squat pattern, except it'll likely be zero to barbell because of either what was taught previously in the industry or just it feels like I'm connecting those dots. It's more integrated, more muscle mass. I have less time. That makes sense. Let's go. Except the quality of the movement is such that the person doesn't get that true stimulation on tissue. It's all over the place. It's bandy legs. It's loading to structure. It's not an effective way of doing it. So choosing, exactly as you said, these more integrated patterns to help future proof, but to also help target more tissue early, especially when, to make this abundantly clear because it gets messed with on the internet a lot, just in every circle a lot. If a tissue is contracting against resistance to a high degree of effort, aka proximity to failure, even if it's a synergistic movement across many muscle groups, if there's a lot of co-contraction, if you have a young enough training age, everything's going to get some stimulation. all of your biases, all of your hyper isolation sort of mentalities, they are also correct. But you can be correct and it not make sense at the time. So if something is contracting to a high degree of effort, high degree of intensity against resistance, aka like circling back to the half needle landmine press, shoulders, pec to some extent, triceps, even into your core, into your legs. If you have like even a dynamic stabilizer can hypertrophy if you have a young enough training age. Let's throw that out there, right? So having these more integrated exercises that are perhaps more constraints based, like the landmine press that we spoke to, that's probably the better choice than say a barbell press, until you get to the point where that is now something that you can organize and coordinate the same way you may be able to do with the landmine press. So in that respect, it might be like the 1 to 3 days a week in person, you're selecting exercises that would target the full body, but in that sort of middle of the road, middle ground. This is externally stabilized, but kind of not, integrates a lot of muscle mass at the same time, that I can safely get to a high degree of effort until, like you said, you can build them towards, all right, I'm doing the more skilled version of this. Maybe it's a dumbbell or a barbell press into a more load heavy variation. Maybe it's a seated dumbbell. Maybe it's a machine variation into just full send absolute effort. Like you said, maybe a lateral raise from the early example with a cable. Things that become skill based future proofing, that has a ceiling on how much time you're dedicating per day, so you can still get to the thing that will actually stimulate tissue as opposed to stimulating future progress. Stimulate a bunch of tissue, ideally probably load biased, 8-ish reps, because you want to be targeting those things probably still earlier in your workout, where you still have the capacity to safely execute it and actually get things close to failure, all the way down to the more externally stabilized things that you can effectively just shut the brain down, go for the nosebleed, go full send effort, and just go.
Love it. Perfect. Can you define proximity to failure?
Okay. So the short-ish version, we'll see if I can do that. So we have the muscle fibers that we care about, the motor units that we care about. They're going to be our type 2s. So Jordan and I are two different styles of training that have overlapping adaptations with respect to muscle growth. His is going to be from Olympic lifting, which is type 2X. Mine would be probably more type 2, I believe it's A. I should know this, but type 2A. His is more explosive style of type 2 fibers. Mine are more probably glycolytic, more capacity driven. But either way, the type 2 muscle fibers, and that's important because your type 1 are more endurance based, aka they take a lot longer to fatigue, and they usually are more associated with endurance exercise. Proximity to failure is the thing that kind of normalizes what muscle fibers and the recruitment of all of them across the complement. And if we're looking for maximal growth, your type 1s are kind of out of the equation because they kind of turn over really fast anyways, and they don't have the greatest degree of hypertrophy potential outright. But your type 2s, both glycolytic as well as explosive style, they have a high degree of hypertrophy capabilities, but also require some stimulation that will require their actual recruitment. So type 2X, more Jiunta style, there's a reason why he's jacked, is because when he goes to do his Olympic lifting, unless everything is recruited all at once, he's probably not going to lift as much as he can successfully, or it's just going to be a failure to launch. It just won't move off the ground. For me to see growth with more of my type 2As, I probably need to get closer to failure through more of an accumulation sort of strategy. So, and that doesn't mean like an excessive amount. It means I'm still trying to fail, probably right around 8 to 10 to 12, maybe 15 reps. And the thing that's happening is through necessity, muscle fibers and motor units will be recruited. And the stimulation is for their growth or for their adaptation will always be that proximity to failure. There's probably a repetition base, not that there's typically zones per se, but an efficiency amount of repetitions that allows you to see a great return on investment on raw muscle growth. And it's because you have to think to yourself, what is the adaptation demand of the exercise and of the repetition scheme? If Jordan is going to fail, what's your average repetition count per set on, say, snap?
1. 1 to 3 is pretty much the entire range.
So that adaptation it's definitely targeting type 2 tissue for sure, but the failure is like that. It's not necessarily getting high degrees of repeated tension and a slow grinding halt where maybe it is going to cycle through a few different motor units or a few different fibers until it gets to the very end. It's he either recruits everything And they all adapt at once through coordination first, and then maybe slow additions second as they get greater and greater exposure to necessity. But the exposure to necessity is extremely slow over a long period of time because he does his 1 to 3 and then he's done. It's not like he's slowly grinding out the fourth because it's literally impossible with that style of exercise. So his addition of muscle fibers and his addition of tissue will take a lot longer. It's definitely possible, but a 1 to 3 rep range versus, say, a 5 to 8 to 10 to 12, presuming the necessity of failure, being close to failure, seeing these involuntary slowing of your repetition speeds happening that is indicative of not being able to complete it, having muscle fibers slowly leave the chat, as it were, because they're getting fatigued out, and more having to take on the brunt of the workload. Having that kind of experience is probably going to be something that's a little bit more time efficient for seeing muscle growth, and that's where you see the recommendations of 6 to 8 to 12 to 15 to whatever. But as long as you're getting close to failure, you're probably recruiting as many of those type 2 of both varieties as you possibly can. You err on the side of load in hypertrophy, being between 6 and 8 for some exercises that are more prone to it. Probably going to recruit a lot more muscle mass just generally. That's your barbells. Everything else can live like 8 to 10 to 12. And because you're in a lot, I guess the other prong of this is the safety of the failure criteria. The other prong of this is if Jiunta fails his snatch, something bad might happen. You don't necessarily want to be continuously going for grinding reps on a snatch, A, because that's not what the exercise is trying to accomplish, and B, the safety of it all. Whereas if we put him in a seated shoulder press, he could probably grind until he physically cannot move it. It like literally pauses right in the middle of the rep and then he dies out to stimulate a little bit more absolute failure that'll get him the stimulation they need. So a ton of probably circular speaking right there, but that's effectively proximity to failure in a nutshell. You see a involuntary slowing of your repetitions that indicates maximal motor unit recruitment and stimulation. Higher loads and more explosive exercise can stimulate it for sure, but there's probably not enough stimulation through that exposure because you have to stop all at once as opposed to being able to sort of grind through it and squeeze every last amount of motor unit and or tension out of those fibers. Whereas a middle ground repetition range allows you the safety to be exposed to truer failure and truer grind.
That is the absolute best explanation I've ever heard of proximity to failure, hands down. Yeah, incredibly helpful. I think I learned a lot from that. I want to add my dumb person stuff to it because I don't know, just because is that when it comes to no, you did great. Trust me, you did great, even if you don't remember it. So part of hypertrophy is effectively loading the targeted tissue, correct?
Yeah.
So with that, I think we also have to look at maybe an aside or an asterisk by this is technical failure also, right? Is the way that I look at this too is, more so in strength training, but it applies with hypertrophy training, absolutely, is when do we start unloading the targeted tissue, right? If that's something like, I don't know what a good example for this would be, maybe like a lying hamstring curl, right? Is if we're in that nice posterior pelvic tilt, maintaining pelvic stability, and we're going through knee flexion, knee extension, we're keeping tension on the targeted tissue. And then maybe we get to a point where we start to lose that pelvic stability. We start to shift some of that tension and we're unloading the hamstrings. We're starting to load more structural tissues or we're loading other tissues to complete that movement, right? I think that's an important aside by this too, is that there's failure at a cellular, at a tissue level, but there's also failure at a technical level too, is that we need to understand the positions that we need to maintain to be able to effectively load the tissue that we're trying to load. And once we get to the point where we're now unloading that tissue, we're having less effective reps, which in some scenarios, maybe that's still compiling into the overall effectiveness category, but also in some other scenarios that may be compiling into the I'm loading structure and the result of this might be that structure breaks down. So I think that's an important point to make too, from, again, my perspective of this being less based in hypertrophy as a place where you live, but hypertrophy as a phase of training where we want to be specific with what we're targeting. And once we start to be less specific with that, there's probably going to be side effects, to say the least, right? Some of those may be positive, some of those may be negative. So we need to understand what the side effects are going to be when we start unloading the target tissues.
Yeah, the way you phrase that, like the consequences of, are we going to delineate between technical failure versus full mechanical failure of the targeted tissue? And the idea is that eventually those two things converge. You develop enough skill, and you are the most complete trainee you can be, where you can have your technical failure and your mechanical failure of the target tissue become one and the same, because you have no gaps. And that's a lifelong venture. That's like what everybody should be going for, in my opinion. And again, I think you phrased it perfectly. Where does that matter the most? And it's, what is the consequence of a technical breakdown during that exercise? The hamstring curl versus, we'll even say, a barbell squat is a perfect example. Hamstring curl, probably what's going to happen is a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt, pre-shortening of the spinal erectors. Maybe it changes the anchor point, or you have a continuous movement of one anchor point. So hamstring, hip, and knee. The idea of a hamstring curl is to flex the knee, but if the hip starts to move as well, both sides of the anchor of that muscle are starting to move. So you're starting to have a less efficient development of tension across just the target tissue that you care about, the hamstrings. Is that fatal? No, you're lying down. Are you going to get no tension on the hamstrings once that happens? No, because it's still contracting against resistance, just you're giving up some degree of that range of motion where it will be doing work. Is it necessarily something that you want to happen on the first rep? No, because that's a really inefficient style of training. And it's probably a red flag that you're either having a technical error, you don't know what you're doing, or there's, again, a gap in some part of your strength. There's a pelvic control issue. There's a core alignment issue. There's something that you don't know, or something that's giving up before the target tissue. Maybe that gets addressed. But in saying that, getting to more full mechanical failure with having a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt as your lying hamstring curls, way less consequence than you're in a high bar squat, and all of a sudden you're getting folded, like folded. And there's a lot of structural loading, probably a lot of your quads, glutes, and adductors, which are probably going to be the biggest prime movers of that exercise. A whole just cacophony, to use that word, of changing leverages and shit going sideways between them being prime movers and emergency stabilizers of the pelvis and the spine. Maybe you don't take that one to the absolute graveyard until you're physically capable of doing so. And like, it just gives you the ability to have the longest runway of that exercise as humanly possible, particularly if you tie it back to the previous part of the conversation where you just put that on a pedestal. That's first. You get your skill-based hypertrophy stimulus there, and then you go do all the other things that are way safer to actually pursue true failure with.
Yeah. Beautiful. I think that's the perfect way to organize it. I think it makes sense once you have that deeper level of context around what failure is in these different scenarios. And it just allows you to go through that system and put your clients in the best position to succeed, right? Through, whether that's through the session, whether that's through the movement, through the session, through the week, through the entire lifetime of your time with that client. I think that really gives a good and effective framework that people can take a look at and actually apply and understand why they're applying it. So I think that's super helpful. It's been a very informative chat with you. I think looking at hypertrophy training on the whole, especially the way that people portray it on the internet, there's so many. You get a 60-second clip of someone telling you something without that further context. So that's why I really love that we have this, hour-long conversational format where you can kind of put these things in the little box that it belongs in, because this stuff isn't wrong, it's not right, it just is. And you need to understand where it exists with it being it. So I think understanding it in this context is a really good way to put this stuff in its boxes in the appropriate places where it belongs or where it doesn't belong. So I absolutely appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk about this with me, because I've actually learned a lot from this also. But anyone that wants to reach out to you, learn more from you. First off, we have you teaching the Prescript hypertrophy course, so be on the lookout for that. Other than that, Bugera is big in the collective, but where can people find you? What's your Instagram, website? Where do you want them to talk to you?
Social media is probably where I live the most. So at Eric Bugera, just my name. I'm sure it'll appear somewhere either on the Prescript site, but just my name, and that's probably where I live the most in terms of I answer basically everything I possibly can. My following isn't that high that I'm super popular enough that I'm running out of time to answer everybody. So any questions there, any comments, anything you want. Website is www.ebugera.com. That's for my personal training online business, as well as a little bit of education, a little bit of anything really you want. Consultation hours are up there too. And that's the other thing too. I offer probably twice a week, 1 hour consultation hours, basically office hours. Like if you're able to book in through my Linktree, through my Calendly, it's a complimentary hour, assuming it's open, and bring whatever question you want. We'll break it down. It's basically a buffet of whatever you want to learn as best as I can help you. So a couple of different ways, but reaching out over social media is probably the easiest.
Awesome. That's such a valuable resource. Make sure you guys capitalize on that. Thanks for your time, Eric.